Yes, we are. Good morning, Chair Bone and members of the Board of Supervisors. John Ford with Planning and Building. Joining me is Michael Richardson, Michelle Nielsen, and Mary Milner to present the 2019 housing element. Before Ms. Nielsen gives a more detailed presentation, I just would like to make a couple of introductory statements. First of all, we're privileged to present the recommendation by the Planning Commission to adopt this housing element. The Planning Commission made this recommendation with a 6-0 vote after considering it over a period of 3 meetings. Also attached to the board report is a letter from the State Department of Housing and Community Development stating that the proposed housing element meets all the legal standards required for certification by HCD. So we're really excited and feeling very good about being able to present to you a document that has been vetted by the public, been vetted by the Planning Commission, and been vetted by HCD. This has been prepared and refined in a very public process. It reflects the understanding that the standard way of preparing housing elements, which is to identify that there's enough zoned property to build housing on, has failed to work, that something different needs to be done. And so what it begins to do is turn that corner and identify that the county will begin to step into the gap to facilitate development of housing. Generally, the comments at the Planning Commission have been positive. I think that if there were any contrary comments, it would be that people would like to see the housing element go further, but that generally people are supportive and appreciative of the direction that the housing element is taking. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Nielsen.
Good morning, Board of Supervisors. Thank you. So the goal of a housing element is to meet statutory requirements, which with a lot of recent flurry over probably beginning in 2016, 2017, there have been many substantial amendments to housing element law. So it needs to meet these detailed statutory requirements. It needs to respond to public input and consider the housing needs of all residents in the community. In the county, it's the unincorporated area, and it's regardless of income level. So everyone who is above moderate market rate housing to those who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. As Director Ford described, here's a bit of the context. We did 2 rounds of public workshops in 4 dispersed locations in the community. Went to Southern Humboldt, went to Willow Creek, we were up in McKinleyville, and then of course in Eureka. The Planning Commission deliberated on this. There were 3 public hearings which were preceded by a public workshop. The public hearings began in May of this year, and our last one before the Planning Commission was in July. And the content before you is the result of input and ideas from the community, and directly reflect that from the Planning Commission, and of course the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. Unlike all the other elements of the general plan, only the housing element is the one that is subject to certification by the state. And a lot of state and federal funding programs, in order to be eligible, having a certified housing element is a threshold requirement. And part of those requirements, in addition to ticking all the boxes with regard to the statutory, is that you meet the timeline that is also spelled out in state law. And for the county, we have a compliant housing element, the current one we're under, also referred to as the 5th cycle, until August 31st. So it is a short timeline, but we've been out in the community, been a lot of input, a lot of opportunities for engagement. So just briefly an overview of the housing element. So it does continue in the tradition of housing elements, making some incremental changes, improvements to the content and the policies, but also it does take some bold approaches. It is overall, altogether represents a paradigm shift if adopted, if it's adopted as presented from the status quo, from business as usual of just, oh, we're just going to tweak the zoning regulations. It moves the planning and building department to this active partnering role with the private sector developers and the community developers, and also to work actively with other county agencies and also with the incorporated cities to address the housing needs of the community. And this is my first housing element rodeo, so to speak. But the input we heard as through this process was pretty consistent, that the status quo was not working, that it was going to take more than just, tweaking the zoning regulations. So to give you some context of kind of the baseline conditions, the growth rate in Humboldt County continues to be relatively low, less than 1%. The regional housing need assessment requirements, these are requirements of how much projected housing need for your community divided by income category is very similar. I'll go have a slide that has a little more detail on that in a moment. And that our biggest need continues to be for units that are affordable to low income or lower households. As we heard at the Planning Commission, is that for housing to be affordable to these income categories, it has to be subsidized housing. And then it's about 70% based on data in May, that about 70% of households in Humboldt County cannot afford a medium-priced house. So this is the RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment. This is the breakdown between the two. So the box on the left shows our current cycle. We're at the end of that. The allocation, the projected need based on our growth level or development in the community from 2014. Then you see the side-by-side comparison with our new regional housing needs assessment for what is called the sixth cycle. We are moving, there's some changes in statutory law back in late 2000s that allowed jurisdictions to move their housing elements from a 5-year update cycle to an 8-year update cycle. So that's why you see that difference. But the annualized rate of production overall across the board is pretty close. It's pretty comparable between the 5th cycle and the 6th cycle. So in terms of, those were our projected needs. This is what has actually got constructed using building permits issued under this current cycle. So as you can see, we had an overproduction in moderate income category and very low production in housing that would be affordable to extremely low and very low income households.
Michelle,
yes.
could you, since we've got the permitted housing in 33 to 44, could you give us examples of each one of those, a unit that was built under that category so we can get a visual?
They were very small, and I think there might have been a couple like accessory dwelling units that were very small. The methodology for estimating the affordability was based on the size of the unit when compared, because we had data on the average construction cost, and we were able to develop a factor to estimate the affordability. That was done as part of the annual progress report filed for 2018. Previous to that, we used income survey data.
So, and I'm thinking, would the Ria Dale and the units down here on 4th Street qualify for any of this?
Yes, they are. Well, those are all located in the incorporated cities, so they are not reflected in these numbers. These numbers are only for the unincorporated areas, so we don't get those. But those units are, I believe, 100% subsidized.
And then so the unincorporated would be the Myrtle Avenue, the Kramer properties. No, they're not actually they're not moderate or low income.
They were
Senior housing, but it's not subsidized.
correct.
Okay.
Those
Right.
units, based on the size, the number of bedrooms, and what the typical rents for those units, those were classified based on that data, and that they're not subsidized as moderate income
Senior.
units.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So with the low production in extremely low, very low, low-income categories, that also presents a challenge for the implementation of housing first, because it's those units that are typically going to be the housing for those folks who are going to be covered by that policy, the board's adopted policy. So this slide just kind of summarizes, gives a high-level overview of what the median home price is. This was prepared in May. Average monthly rent and minimum income requirements. Then also, this was prepared using California Association of Realtors data and the Humboldt State Economic Index from May. So ultimately, this gives a snapshot of what the breakdown is in terms of, might help if I could see it better. Based on the number of households and their earning, what they're earning, as you can see, more than 50% cannot afford and don't have the annual needed median income to buy the typical median priced house, which is just over $67,000. Let me back up a little bit. The needed annual income to afford the typical house, which is about $310,000, you need an annual income of about $67,000. And that's through like a very traditional mortgage, traditional down payment. And then somewhere then in that kind of dark green, you see that there's about 5,300 households that may or may not have that income, meet that threshold, because their income falls in between being $50,000 to $75,000 annually. And then we have folks who, over 8,000 households that would be able to, because their income is greater than $75,000. So with that, what's new with the settlement? So what it suggests, the background data, the public input, is that the traditional regulatory methodology isn't going to be sufficient to address the housing situation in the county. So this element establishes goals, policy standards, and implementation measures that will make these changes to hopefully get the county out of the way and to enable increased production of housing that is affordable and that there's enough housing for all income categories. And there's we broken into 4 key areas. That the county will be a proactive partner for housing development. What does that look like? That would be there's an implementation measure 62, which is for fast tracking and streamlining of all housing projects. That implementation measure actually establishes timelines as to when the county will engage with applicants on their building permit applications, when they will issue those building permits, and if the planning building department fails to do, what the consequences are to that if we aren't engaged in working with applicants to get their building permits done. It includes also just part of it would be the more residential technical assistance we have the planner on duty program, but to make that program more robust than what it is currently. Another change from the status quo is to better respond to the people who are experiencing homelessness or most at risk experiencing homelessness, including policies and implementation measures for supportive housing. There were this in part reflects statutory changes that supportive housing is to be a by right use in commercial and districts or zoning districts where multifamily is permitted. To also update the zoning regulations to move the regulations closer to be with the letter of the statute with regard to emergency shelters. Right now, there's qualifying language in the zoning regulation stipulating where they're mapped in C2M, community commercial, light industrial, industrial commercial, and residential multifamily. Where they're specifically mapped, emergency shelters are principally permitted. There's a policy and implementation measures to remove the qualifying language of the map. It would be the same zoning districts, but it would remove that qualifying language. So, and that was, the mapping was largely based on housing opportunity zones, which are communities that have community water and sewer. So there are other communities where they're like Willow Creek, the Hoopa area, more Willow Creek, where there are people experiencing homelessness, but there's no ability to do an emergency without a discretionary permit. They would still be subject to a building permit, of course. So improve access to expertise. Part of some of the implementation measures that look at doing this is that residential technical assistance program, where we're out in the communities doing housing seminars and making ourselves available in the outlying areas to help people with their building permit applications or their planning permit applications. To increase the inventory and range of the pre-approved housing plans, and to also keep those plans current. Another component of this is to maintain and to update our inventories online of parcels where these uses are allowed, to do some more pre-screening of those and to make that information readily available to the public. And then to this measure, in sum, captures policies and implementation measures that look at tiny houses, movable tiny houses. Right now, a movable tiny house would not be an allowed use except for in a special occupancy park. So there's implementation measures to amend the zoning regulations to make that an allowed use and recognize it as a residential structure. There would be a legislative action because it would take a change to the zoning ordinance. There would be public workshops and public hearings. So there will be a part 2 to actually make these changes. Another one is there was pretty significant changes to state law regarding accessory dwelling units. In county nomenclatures, that's been secondary dwelling units, but to adopt a local regulations that better reflects our local community. So, wait, let me go back, actually. Oops. So the Planning Commission recommendations, as part of their recommendations, they asked that there's 2 changes or 2 additions to the implementation measures that were added based on their comments on July 11th. And then there's one, it's not in there because that being the Planning Commission recommended that incentives be retained for affordable housing projects. There was, at one of the hearings, there was a lot of discussion about the affordability of housing, and so staff recommended, well, we could change the measures regarding incentives and make them available across the board, and the outcome they considered that, and the outcome on July 11th was to reserve the incentives as they were written for affordable housing projects. So the other 2 recommendations that are incorporated into the housing element are to do annual progress reports to the Planning Commission, and then at the midpoint of the cycle to do a more robust review on whether a sufficient progress is being made. And if it not, perhaps to further amend the housing element, to look at other measures to improve the housing conditions, that would come to your board, should that come to pass. But the annual progress reports is written in there. And the other one measure that was written was to create partnerships and to support our local tribes, the federally and state recognized tribes, and their efforts to provide housing for the community. And so with respect to the revisions requested by HCD, they asked that quantified objectives be added to some specific implementation measures. Those have been added to expand the narratives and discussions regarding what progress was made. That was also made, that change was made, better describe public engagement and update the demographic and housing data to be more reflective of current data. And probably the biggest change was we previously were recommending that the Hubbard Lane parcel be retained in the affordable land inventory, and we documented why, and they disagreed with us, largely because the units, the building permits have been pulled. We don't have evidence to support them as being affordable to moderate above, so they recommended that it be removed in order for us to have a certifiable housing element. The housing element before you incorporates that recommendation.
Is anybody stacking any permits or anything, trying to get some stuff through before the required solar? And I mean, we have the required non-flammable building materials, because we're doing our best to make anything affordable not affordable by adding everything on. You can't buy a stripped down model anymore. So before you ever pour a slab, you're $120,000, $130,000 into a lot, even a small lot. So
I'm aware of several contractors who did pull the building permits they anticipate working on over the course of the next year. They're targeting having those done by the end of 2019. I wouldn't say that's a huge number.
No, understand. But, and there's no way we can, if somebody comes in with that affordable housing units, that's all state mandated now, right?
It becomes part of the building code. That's correct.
Okay.
So just briefly, staff has prepared a addendum to the programmatic EIR that was certified for the county's general plan, and then also the Planning Commission resolution. As Director Ford said, their recommendation is for the housing element to be adopted. We did, as part of the Planning Commission resolution, there is language regarding changes of edits are made to the document in response to comments from the Department of Housing and Community Development, that those would be considered minor. And that did transpire. We did receive additional comments subsequent to July 11th, and those, and it's consistent with, those edits are consistent with the language of the Planning Commission's resolution, so it's within the scope of that. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Any questions? Supervisor Fennell?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the ADUs, accessory dwelling units, as a component of this plan.
So the policy language, or I'll say that the implementation measure is to adopt amendments to the zoning regulations to allow accessory dwelling units consistent with state law, which does prescribes pretty strictly what a jurisdiction can regulate with respect to accessory dwelling units. by state law, they are allowed in the zoning districts where residential, single-family structures are permitted. Then if there's also limits on what a jurisdiction could regulate with regard to conversion of an existing garage, for example, that may not meet setbacks. It can be converted to an accessory dwelling unit without having to meet the setbacks. There's standards regarding parking if the dwelling unit is within a half mile of a transit stop. A bus stop is adequate under the statute. You can't require additional parking for the accessory dwelling unit. Really, local regulation is limited primarily to public health and safety, and any development standards have to be objective, which that's a policy in the housing element, which is basically standards like the development, the structure shall be substantially consistent with the character of the neighborhood is not objective, because what that means is interpreted differently by different people. And so an objective standard is shall be set back 20 feet from the front yard setback. So that's a big, also seen across the board in housing element law that will trickle down. Is that your standards need to be objective. Any mixed use zone, if you're housing, it's like supportive housing, the standards that apply need to be objective. And when your standards are not objective, and you're dealing especially with affordable housing or supportive standard housing, those standards are basically set aside.
If I could add on to that, the board also today approved us applying for an HCD grant.
Right.
And part of that is to implement some of this, which would allow us to do such things as update a website to educate people how to put together applications for accessory dwelling units, how they can get permitted, what resources are available, what funding's available, how to coordinate with lenders, and that sort of thing. The other thing that we'd like to do with that, and it may be premature to bring this up, but it is something that I think we would really like to find a way to do, is to underwrite the cost of the permit processing, particularly for accessory dwelling units. It's our understanding that for like a $50,000 to $60,000 cost of an accessory dwelling unit, the fees associated with that are around $8,000. So if we could develop a program by which they could come in, get the building permit without paying those fees, that's about a 15 to a 20% savings in the total cost of that.
Yeah. Meeting the definition of affordable. Yeah. And so is it your thought that can be part of a state program?
Yeah, actually, the Cal Home program is the governor, as part of this year's housing legislation, did modify the program to allow underwriting and actually program funding for income eligible families for accessory dwelling units. That was previously a housing category dwelling unit type that was not within the scope of that funding.
Thank you.
Supervisor Bass?
I would say, Michelle, I really appreciated your thorough presentation. You didn't even need to look at your notes. So I was like going, but I mean, I read through it and I really appreciate, you really know what you're talking about, and I just appreciate that. And thank you. Actually, the whole team is wonderful.
Supervisor Madrone? Anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, first of all, thank you for an incredible job on all of the staff's part. I attended quite a few of the outreach meetings in the communities in my district, and there was a lot of participation. I mean, you look at the public comment on this thing, what I think, 170 or something like that, individual comments. So kudos to all of you for an incredible outreach effort in a tight timeline. And I really appreciate the effort that's been made to help the county move to a more proactive position of engaging the communities, engaging nonprofits, and others to try and start solving what we know is an incredibly serious problem here in Humboldt County, as well as many places. So I see a lot of really great elements that you've put into this to encourage a lot of innovative ways of getting this stuff done, like what you just said about the ADU approach of trying to reduce costs and stuff like that. I've reviewed the information thoroughly. I find it to be incredibly comprehensive on many, many levels, and I appreciate that work. So with that, I do have a couple of very minor amendments I wanted to offer up to my colleagues and to the planning staff to see if we might be able to do that. I certainly don't want to do a lot of tweaking around because getting that letter from the state that says, this looks fantastic, we're ready to approve it, I don't want to mess with that. I know we have a tight timeline. We basically either do it today or next week to meet the August 31st deadline or risk some penalties. So I don't want to mess with that either way as well. The couple of very minor things I think that I might suggest, you know, as we talk about climate change and our climate change policies and other kinds of things, and we think about how all of this not only affects the ability to increase our housing stock, and I think it was something like 41% of the need is in the low and very low income categories based on the median income information that was provided and the rest of it. And in order to not compound our problems of putting high density development in areas without bus service, without good pedestrian access and all those kinds of things, I am a little bit concerned about encouraging increased density development in rural areas. When you look at the housing opportunity zones, it does include several significant rural communities that don't have those services. And so that's a little concerning. And so looking at policy H-P1 on page 8-14 of chapter 8 housing element, so H-P1, I would simply strike the last part at targeted residential density. 3 words to be removed from there. I don't think that would have any impact on state's approval. But in combination with that, we might carefully consider the housing opportunity zones and where we're encouraging this, and maybe not to be encouraging high density in areas that don't have those services because of the impact on fossil fuel use and other things. So that would be the first one, and maybe we'll just take these one at a time if that works for the chair.
Yes, Mr. Ford?
Yes, thank you, and completely understand what Supervisor Madrone you were saying here. We would want to point out, though, that targeted residential density is kind of a state buzz term.
Sure.
And their emphasis is on achieving or exceeding the residential density. So while that may not seem like a big change to the state mind, that may signal the county's backing away from wanting to maximize the number of units that are going to be produced.
Okay, I understand that. And really, I think perhaps more importantly is the maps of the housing opportunity zones and where we're encouraging that development. I mean, clearly, McKinleyville, Eureka, you know, these areas, they do have these services. But some of the areas do not. And so maybe it's a consideration that my colleagues and I want to make in discussion with you about, are all of these areas really appropriate to have increased densities to those targeted levels? If they don't have those services, we're kind of working at odds, you know, here in terms of increasing density in places where we're going to increase reliance on fossil fuel use. Where areas that don't have bus service, for instance. The bus does stop in Rio Dell, I believe, and Scotia. Is that correct? Yep. So that's good. And I know they're making great strides to try and improve pedestrian-friendly environments in those communities as well. Does WIOT have bus service?
We have bus service all the way to the south.
So they stop
All the way.
They stop at
Yes,
WIOT.
we have Mars Flat,
Yeah.
Miranda,
Right.
and so
Okay. Okay, well, that was a couple of questions, so I guess I'll go ahead and let that one fall by and working with my colleagues on that part of it. But that was a concern. you know, perhaps it's really something that won't be a problem. So I can appreciate your input on that. The other one, I really like all the allowances for tiny houses, tiny house villages, the rest of it. There's a lot of us working to try and help the Hupa tribe reopen the modular plant out in Hupa that is currently shut, but it is state-of-the-art facility, completely wholly owned. And I've got some meetings with Department of Health and Human Services and others to try and see, now that we're having a more innovative housing element approach, can we find a way to take unutilized funding in the various counties surrounding Hupa, work with the tribe to reopen that facility to build tiny homes. One of the big problems out there was trying to haul full-size homes on the highway. The length, the width created highway patrol escorts, all kinds of extra costs. And so many in the community, including Kenny Spain with Headwaters and us, are working to try and figure out how we can take unutilized resources and put them to bear to create some of this housing that would in fact be affordable in small ways for a lot of people. So that's something that I'm very excited about and hoping to move that forward rapidly. The other one was H-IM Implementation Measure 15 on page 8-24, also in Chapter 8. Facilitate development of sites in the affordable housing land inventory. And then it ends up, that particular paragraph and the incentives end up focusing on multifamily zones. And I would just like to offer a very simple amendment, facilitate development of all sites. So adding the word all in the heading there, of all sites in the affordable housing land inventory, and then add the word specifically at the start of that paragraph. So it doesn't change much. It just says, where we can, let's facilitate development in all sites in that housing land inventory. So those are two very minor edits, adding the word all and specifically. So it doesn't really change the intent of that paragraph, but it does help open it up. And actually further down in the paragraph, it does talk about all sites in those zones. So it kind of makes it more consistent. Feedback on that suggestion from?
We have no objections to that.
Okay, those are pretty minor. Just adds a little bit of intent there. So
where would you put this specifically before specifically the county shall allow?
So under implementation item 15,
Yeah, I know, but.
in the heading, I would add the word all,
Yeah,
and then at the beginning of that paragraph, specifically. So in other words, we're not just saying we do this in the multifamily zones. We're allowing a little more freedom for the planning department to consider this in all zones that are included in that affordable housing land inventory. Simple change, but actually has a big effect in terms of allowance of consideration, while still focusing on these multifamily zones. Not trying to change that focus, because that's where it's perhaps most appropriate. So that's all I have on that end of things. So thank you for that opportunity.
Welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did have, no, that was it.
Yes, no? Good?
I'm good.
Perfect. All right, with that, I'll open it up to public comment.
It's your friend's time now. Let's stop.
Hello, my name is Bill Rodstrom. I work at the Jefferson Community Center. And I just want to thank the planners and all staff on what a good job they did on this housing element. It does really provide for a lot more opportunities now. And I do think that the devil's going to be in the details more in the part two, what Michelle referred to, the zoning part. So a lot of these goals and implementation measures aren't going to meet our RENA goals without those zoning changes, and she alluded to that too. So I'm hoping that we have the opportunity coming up now to really expand the areas that we can increase density and the diversity of types of housing. For instance, along bus routes that we've talked about, like in McKinleyville, Myrtle Avenue, Harris, south of Harris, into Campton Heights area. A lot of those R1 areas could be R2, R3, and allow for more density within 1,000 feet of a bus route. So those are some of the things that I'm looking forward to, because I expect it'll be another public process like Eureka went through with their zoning. And that's a good model, but you might be able to even go beyond that. And I like the idea that after a year or two, see how we're meeting the RENA numbers, and that at least one of the planning commissioners suggested maybe we have to do inclusionary zoning if we're not really getting there to in the future after checking with RENA, because that's always been the problem with the last housing elements. You might have remembered 10 years ago the Find Our Lots issue. The zoning wasn't there. So it'd be great if the zoning would allow development on smaller lots. And I'd actually like to see, I like that proactive idea. And if there's state money to help with infrastructure and helping with the roads, the water, the sewer lines, so that the contractor doesn't have to pay for, and add that to the cost of housing. The state used to, I think, pay for much of that. And if those funding sources could be looked for through HCD, which is the likely source, that could bring down costs for housing too. So anyway, I look forward to the next process, but it looks like we'll be passing this on. It sounds like a very good housing element, and I'm looking forward to the zoning part. Take care.
Thank you. Next.
Ken Slawski, ditto what the last speaker said. I've been trying to work with Michelle a little bit, and she'll have a little time after this passes, requesting an opportunity zone, actually 2 of them, for my 2 projects, which I've talked to you about, that I've been trying to do forever. Of course, both of these are going to incorporate my facilitating building the bus stops that would be necessary. They cater to the senior people or to people who would need that kind of a thing. Both of these facilities have the maximum amount of public services available. The one in Willow Creek doesn't have sewer because there's no sewer treatment plant. It may never be up there, and it won't service my particular parcel, but they're just outside of town, just a little bit past where Danco already has a rather large development in that area. And for staff to work with us, and I would like to try and get my 2 parcels, both the one on 96 and the one out in Supervisor Madrone's district out there in Glendale, mapped for this, I call it carrot zone. We like those carrots. There are those of us who are extremely interested in this. I had 2 other partners, 3 of us from Blue Lake Enterprises. We started out building 4-plexes, 10-plexes in affordable housing many years ago, and now all of us have a son that's interested in son-in-law for one of them, who's interested in continuing what we do, including possibly building the tiny houses and working with that, even up in the Hoopah facility that was mentioned a little while ago by Supervisor Madrone. So we do have the expertise. We have access to it through a genetic osmosis of building affordable projects, and a skill set where, doing major subdivisions. It's not like this isn't what we do. So I appreciate the opportunity to get this aligned. I will be reaching out to some of the other people that have the financial capability. My one partner, just to know, he walks into Coast Central and they say, you have the most loans with Coast Central in Humboldt County. And yet we can't get a loan online through one of these things because I don't know why it is. But we have the financial ability, backing, and expertise to do these projects. And I look forward to working with your staff to hopefully bring at least the 2 I'm thinking of to fruition. Thank you for my opportunity to speak on this great housing element. Tiny homes and things like that are our future, and we can't do housing first on any basis with regular constructed houses. It's not financially viable. We have to think outside of the box, and this is the box I want to think in. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no one else? Oh. Somebody has to come up, or I'll close it.
Thanks. I'm Nezzie Wade, and I'm with Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives. Most of you know that for the last 5 years we've been talking about a lot of these alternatives. I'm very happy that we have this housing element. It represents an awful lot of work for an awful lot of people. And I really appreciate all the community coming together and the places where they've held meetings and have spoken up and talked about the things that are necessary. I think we all know that these alternatives will be very helpful for folks with no resources or very few resources. And I've lived a lot of my life in that arena for quite a while now. So I'm very excited about the possibility of having some change. I know that we're still a far cry from that. Affordable housing for a lot of people is housing that's still very unavailable to a lot of the folks that have, they fall through the cracks all the time. So we hope to be able to close up some of that gap. And I want to say thank you to the planning department for being relentless and having the stamina to just do all that. That has taken a lot, and we're all really very appreciative. And I look in your faces and see that you're about to make some decisions too, and I really appreciate that you've given it full thought and consideration, and know that we are in a shelter crisis, and we really have to do something to pull ourselves beyond where we are, and I think this is the thing to do. So thank you very much, and thank you to the planning department.
Thank you. Now,
Third time is a charm, right?
That's right.
Coming from Southern Humboldt, I had to recycle some of these folders for your presentation.
perfect.
Folders, so sorry about that. I only found out about 6 o'clock last night that I was
We like recycling.
seeing you. Yeah, I do too. So in order to make sure I don't forget anything, I'm going to read the cover letter that I had for this packet for you. Good morning. My name is Patricia Ray. I'm a volunteer in Southern Humboldt, interested and committed to creating options and solutions for our houseless community. My role and mission today is to provide you information about the houseless situation in Southern Humboldt. Your packet has information that addresses the key concerns our community faces. Many in our community are fearful of the houseless, and vigilante behavior has occurred in response to this fear. In 2007-09, I became involved with local efforts to develop and implement a critical weather shelter at our local veterans building. I learned about the needs and the various responses of the houseless population in structured, sheltered, and housing. The houseless population has grown considerably since then. As part of the emergency preparedness team, I am drawn back into the role of helping to find a solution for our houseless community. This is not only a health and safety concern, it is a humanitarian crisis. Southern Humboldt Housing Opportunities is a committed community group that has been meeting for 5 years and recently formed as a nonprofit 501(c). SHOW provides critical weather shelter, meals, clothes, and personal care items, with creating a tiny home community as a long-term goal. A safe camp model is a transition solution. Outreach efforts are ongoing in relationship to identifying and securing private or public property for long-term and interim goals to address the houseless crisis in Southern Humboldt. We are working together for the higher good. On the whole, the reception from the community regarding the letter, which is in your packet, I wrote, has been positive. The letter was locally published, and I used various social media to educate about the houseless. Outreach to local law enforcement, the Chamber of Commerce, as well as face-to-face contact with many folks over the last few months allowed our community to be informed about this safe camp. 2nd District Supervisor Estelle Fennell nominated me to the Housing Trust Fund and Homelessness Solution Committee. This appointment helps me to stay abreast of and connected to county-level discussion as we work together to find solutions, and currently to expedite creating safe camps. Winter is soon upon us. My group's goal is to assist campers to move from private property and other locations to a structured camp. Over the last few years, in-depth discussions with houseless people in Southern Humboldt revealed several priorities expressed by the folks living on the street. Access to showers and restroom facilities, along with safer, structured camping, ranked highest. We also found that these discussions that many prefer to live in a tent rather than a shelter, even in winter conditions. The A-Camp Constitution, which is also in your packet, are rules that a few of our local campers collaborated on for camp guidelines. It would take little to help our camper community to be comfortable, safe, and feel accepted. Communication and kindness will go a long way in creating this camp. A safe camp provides our houseless community with options. There are some persons that will be unable to tolerate a group camp. Should someone decide against the camp, they can be assisted into relocating elsewhere with their belongings. Another option is a bus ticket home or other locale. We have identified some potential state property in southern Humboldt and request the Board of Supervisors' support towards acquiring this property. I appreciate your time today and thank you in advance for any support and assistance that may be available to help us move forward toward our housing goals. It is imperative that we establish a camp before winter. November 15th is our goal date. This property needs to be large enough for 30 campsites, 60 residents. Thank you very much. If there's any
Thank you very much.
questions.
Thank you. No.
Okay.
Next.
Could you start it now, please? Sorry. I'm already nervous. I'm here to ask that you make 3 changes to this wonderful document. They all relate to homelessness. The first is regarding standard S7. I would like to see this language that replaces the 10-year plan with the plan that you all adopted and with the strategy that you all adopted in your resolution a few years ago. I've got it here. This adds standards, specifically the standards from your resolution are that that the work be collaborative with the community, create a sustainable strategy and human infrastructure to implement the housing first. That's the strategy that you all adopted. The board resolution regarding policy, that's strategy. Regarding policy is already here in the housing element at policy P45. So this is putting the strategy of your policy into the housing element. There was concern that the county, there was concern about HHAC, which is an important organization, but that's already in the document at implementation 12. So the second thing I'm asking is regarding implementation 11, and I would like to replace the board adopted, let's see, the board adopted plan needs to be updated. And so I put the board adopted plan in replace of the 10-year plan. It needs to be updated, and that would include review of the 10-year plan. So doing both. There was concern about I included a number of recommendations. Those were only, these may happen. And the reason I included them is that conformity with the Housing First approach is important. Lastly, use of the shelter crisis declaration. The third change is regarding the shelter crisis declaration, and it is simply too important to be left out. If you look at I have a copy of the shelter code from the state, and it actually refers to you being immune from liability and other things in providing emergency housing.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you.
First of all, I want to share everybody who spoke that this is an extraordinary group. I could not be more impressed by the work they've done. What brings me back to this issue is, and I mentioned it at the Planning Commission, but I have a list of 26 people who died on our streets from July until April. And, you know, as I said, if that happened, if someone came and murdered them, it would be a crisis, it'd be world news. So the question I ask myself is, what is in this document? What is in the work? What is in the hearts and the spirits and the capabilities of you and our community that can do something that stops and prevents those kinds of deaths which are unnecessary? And what I found is, you know, it was tempting, because actually I have about 3 feet more of these documents. Not kidding. I said, what is in here? I really want to find out. And I think in the 3 minutes I have, I could talk a lot about. One thing I want to stress is that even HCD says that you should not count shelters if it doesn't qualify, if the people you're talking about don't qualify. In other words, if you don't have a shelter for people with drug problems, you know, then don't count them as being, you know, being eligible for shelter. But here's the thing: when I looked at all the different people, you know, groups and cities and counties and laws, the key element was partnerships. The key element was vision. The key element was leadership. And so we have a wonderful document here. We have a community that cares. But I think what even matters as much is the leadership from all of you, because it's almost a joke. They keep making law after law after law about NIMBYism, like this law is going to stop NIMBYism. Well, it's not. You say you're going to put a shelter somewhere, you're going to get your phone's going to ring off the hook. You're going to put your political life in danger, in a sense, because people really don't want it. And so that's where I think we really can be the leaders, because of the support for tiny houses in all different realms. There are different types. The ones that AHA are doing are based very much on self-management model. Others aren't so much. But the bottom line is that we have a chance here to really use the community and the partnerships that have started to create alternatives. And one of the models, I think, if people are listening, is to go to San Jose, because they early on took it on as an issue. And, you know, I don't have time here to read it, but they basically talk about that in their housing element, they talk about researching, exploring other options. So I would just ask, we don't stop at tiny houses. If you talk to AHA, they have a whole continuum of care that really starts with, as the one woman said, people are very different. So let's move on this. We need you to be the leaders, because you're still going to get your phones ringing off the hook. And the thing about tiny houses, I just want to say, is everyone I read about, they
Thank
work
you.
to be good neighbors, and so you can sell that.
Thank you very much. Next.
There we go, that kind of works. My name is Scott Nelson. I'm a resident of Humboldt County. Thanks for listening today. I want to echo the remarks of everybody else and thank the planning staff for their outreach effort. They were willing to take the time to meet with community groups. They were willing to take the time to hear concerns of average citizens. I also want to point out that it seems a little bit backwards to me anyway, that the most important thing coming before the board today also happened to be the very last thing on the agenda. I think it is no surprise that when you look around, those of us who are to be able to be here to make public comment are probably not the people who are going to be helped most profoundly by this housing element. The folks that need affordable housing that don't have it in this county are not here right now because they're out working, or they're out trying to find a job, or they're out trying to find a place to live. I also want to point out that everybody in here is white right now, and that there's a distinct racial element to this. I also really appreciate planning staff at the county and in various municipalities here being really good about paying attention to that, about dealing with how, as we move forward, we can build an equitable county where we talk in a deeper way, not just about housing that's affordable, but about housing that supports all people, regardless of who they are and where they come from. Finally, I just want to advocate for two things specifically in the element. One, the element calls to the establishment of a safe parking pilot program. Right now, you have so many citizens in this county who get constantly hassled by county sheriffs who are just doing their job. let's be honest. And people are not given the opportunity to have safe shelter, even though they may already have a vehicle that provides that safe shelter. This document starts to work on the implementation of creating a program that fixes that, and that's really exciting. Finally, this document also calls for the county to take an official stand on the repeal of Article 34. Article 34 is a California constitutional amendment that got passed in 1950 that actually started right here in Humboldt County, that said that you have to vote anytime you're going to provide more money for low-income or affordable housing. It has held back development in this county and across the state, and I appreciate the bold stand that is in the element to potentially repeal that. I think that's really powerful, and so I thank you for your time, and I hope that in the future we can continue to move forward in a way that lets more folks from the community be able to be here to participate on such an important topic. Thanks.
I appreciate that, and kind of wish this was the last thing on the agenda, but we have a full afternoon too, so appreciate that. With that being said, we do have a time set for 11 a.m. Supervisor Fennell, quickly.
Well, first of all, I think I want to echo what everybody has said. This is a lot of work. It's tremendous, and I really appreciate the proactive approach. I think this is a win-win-win for the county, for people who need the housing, and for people who are the ones who are actually going to build that housing. And so that's really, really important. And I'd like to also, at a future date, try and help the concept that Patty brought forward. I look at that as some way that if they have identified state property and the state is saying that they support those kind of activities, then we need to help them to get, give them a little oomph. So I'll talk about that in the future. But with that in mind, I would like to say I'd like to move staff recommendation.
Second.
Supervisor Monroe?
May I offer
And
this?
include those two on HIM.
At all.
It would add the word all and specifically
Yeah, that's fine.
to item IM 15.
15, right. I can include that.
I would also ask at this time that one additional minor amendment, because I also want to get this done. I think we've had a lot of good input from the community. I appreciate people showing up here today. But in the response to Mrs. Eggers' comments that were submitted, and she's done a great job of showing up at all the meetings and offering some suggestions, I see here in the response from Planning and Building on July 23rd, the board may consider amending the Planning Commission's recommended language to be inclusive of the Homeless Strategy and Implementation Plan Phase 1 and Resolution 16-30. So the Planning Department already said basically that'd be fine. If we could just simply add that amendment, it would be responsive to public comments. In regards to the other couple of comments, I think that staff have made some responses to that, and I can see the strategy there. But I would like to just add that one comment. It'd basically be adding the recommended language to be inclusive of Homeless Strategy and Implementation Plan Phase 1 and Resolution 16-30 that we passed as a board. So would the motion maker and the seconder agree with that second amendment?
As a seconder, I have a question. I did read it in here that staff said that they could support that piece potentially of language, but not the deleted language. But so I'd like to ask staff, because I don't know if we covered it, and I think the maker of the motion is trying to kind of
See where it fits, yeah.
yeah, also. So if I could ask staff to weigh in on the response that was on this
I'll
letter.
just tell you a little bit about my thinking here. I've seen a trend in recent meetings where a motion is made, and then there's a lot of tweaking after that. And I'd prefer the clarity of voting on the motion, but I guess we can discuss it a little bit. So I'd like some more thoughts on that.
With respect to, through the chair, Ms. Eggers' comments regarding modifying standard H7, so staff would be in support of amending to be inclusive of Resolution 1630 and also the Focus Strategies report, but not to strike the language with regard to the 10-year plan, as that is also an important organization for addressing homelessness and those at risk in our community, even though they are a separate entity. They're valuable as well. So to be inclusive.
So with that in mind, I'd like, first of all, my motion was to approve staff recommendation with the modifications we discussed earlier on HIM 15. Can you help me make it very clear what this additional request would look like in the motion?
So, or you put it up there. So I think we would simply indicate that the county adopted 10-year plan to end homelessness, and Resolution 16-30 and the focus strategy will guide the county's efforts to address the housing and service needs of the homeless and at-risk homelessness populations.
Have you got that, Brooke? Okay,
It's on the tape.
thank you. Okay.
Yeah, that answers it. Thank you, through the chair. And I will also say that I do appreciate your concerns for tweaking things after that.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to
really-
be responsive to public comment. It's really, and it seemed like a simple suggestion that planning staff felt supportive of, so thank you for that consideration.
And staff has seen more than responsive to public comment, as long as it's inputted at the proper time.
Yeah.
I think that's the tweaking part, bringing things in at the last minute.
You bet.
Yeah.
And with that, with the changes, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None?
Another deadline met.
We are going to